So in this presentation, I want to talk about the idea of independence for Alberta, more widely than Alberta, but essentially about Alberta. And I'm going to do so under 7 different topic areas. I'm going to try to do this fairly quickly because I know that attention spans aren't that long anymore, and I want to give you good content without making it too long. I'm going to be as fact-based as I can. I want to advance, obviously, a particular position, but this presentation is really on my own behalf. I'm not representing anybody else. I don't have authority to do so. I have gaps in my own knowledge and understanding, but as best I can piece things together, that's what I'm trying to do with this presentation. Western independence has been on my mind for multiple years. I'm originally from Saskatchewan. I flirted with the idea when I was back there, but now having lived in Alberta for the majority of my life, I'm increasingly thinking about the idea that independence is better for us. I was a fairly strong nationalist in my youth, but I have lost faith that Confederation ever really worked for us. Increasingly, I see myself as a Western, not as a Canadian. Ted Byfield, who was a commentator from the West, said the only way a Western-based party can bring about change in Canada is to threaten to leave the Canadian Confederation and mean it. The election of such a party to provincial office would bring about change instantly. Anything short of this will fail. I also have my mind drift to this topic because I still have some vague hopes of writing a book someday on the perennial question of this country. What does it mean to be Canadian? And as I've mulled through that, as I've gathered materials, I continue to struggle to find a deep and meaningful answer. And in fact, our current Prime Minister himself advocates that there is no deep and meaningful answer. He says we are the first post-national country and claims that, quote, there is no core identity, no mainstream in Canada. This might be an attractive idea to some people, but it strikes me as an immature refusal to grow up and take responsibility for who we are and who we can be. I would argue probably that the reasons for the differences between us and Canada originally were geographic, but that history, economics, politics, and culture have reaffirmed those differences as well as grown out of and reinforced the geographic differences. So my purpose in this presentation is to invite you to actively join in realizing a better and a brighter vision for Alberta. So most people associate separatism in Canada with Quebec. But even if we date the movement back to the first organization seeking independence for that province, and that organization was l'Alliance Laurentienne, it only goes back to 1957, when Quebec was just 90 years old within the Canadian Confederation. Alberta was 30 years into Confederation when discussion of our own separatism received attention under the 1935 social credit governments. Not only were we younger, it historically happened sooner. Since then, the idea has never really died. Alberta first emerged after the Second World War, when Alberta introduced legislation to better control our natural gas resources. This resulted in Ottawa calling for military pressure to direct our actions as they wanted. Wikipedia notes that, quote, by 1954, it was widely understood that predatory encroachments from outside monopolies were backed by the federal government in opposition of Albertan efforts. The Independent Alberta Association dated to the early 70s. The Western Canada concept was formed in 1980, responding to feelings of alienation from the Western provinces generally. The Confederation of Regions Party of the mid-80s wanted greater justice for the West without leaving Confederation and wanted to do this through a change to how we were represented. In the 90s, the Federal Reform Party, which was not separatist itself, but had significant players within its formation who were from the West, did give ear to our concerns. But this diluted when Reform Transformed joined into the Canadian Alliance, and diluted even further when it transformed again into the Conservative Party of Canada. The formation of a Liberal government in 2015 under Justin Trudeau, and with the re-election with a minority government in 2019, has done a lot to drive the current efforts to realize full independence for this province. Albertans are an abused minority with this confederation, and we continue to allow ourselves to suffer this abuse, is my view. In 2010, Justin Trudeau was asked about Quebec's place in Canada, and he argued that that province would do better in confederation than independently. But he also commented that we haven't fully seen this. Canada isn't fully what it could be because, as he said, Canada isn't doing well right now because it's Albertans who control our community and socio-democratic agenda. It doesn't work. He was asked to clarify that he really believed that Quebecois serve Canada better, and he said, quote, "I'm a liberal, so of course I think so, yes. Certainly when we look at the great prime ministers of the 20th century, those that really stood the test of time, they were MPs from Quebec. This country, Canada, it belongs to us." So there's a number of motivations we've already hinted at some of those, but motivations for us to look at independence. Primarily, I think the strongest arguments really are economic, but I want to give a little attention to the other ones first and then build into the more substantial arguments. So there are these geographic differences between the regions of Canada, and they affect and are affected by other qualities, as I said before. Confederation has always favored central Canada politically and economically on the backs of other regions, especially the resource-rich West. There are many substantive, practical frustrations that have kept separation as a viable option for Alberta, almost from 1905 when we joined the Canadian Confederation. George Black, who was a Yukon MP, said it's 3,000 miles from Whitehorse to Ottawa and 30,000 miles from Ottawa to Whitehorse. And although he was speaking for the territories, that's a sentiment that kind of speaks to our experience as well. Ottawa does not understand, and frankly, I believe Ottawa does not care, does not need to care. And by Ottawa, I basically mean central Canada. When asked by poll if Alberta is treated unfairly, 63% of Canadians generally said we are. 73% of Westerners and 83% of Albertans, more specifically, shared that viewpoint. The West has a more conservative outlook, preferring smaller government and individual liberties. We see this show up in federal elections. Western urban centers, and especially the Fraser Valley, give more mixed outcomes, but our rural voters go blue. So given our very limited representation in Parliament, and that the policy of the federal Liberals benefit those in the East, the West does not get anything effectively. We get substantively shut out from our own government. By the time Westerners go to the polls, the government has usually been decided. And so this really looks like just a variation of taxation without any real representation. Most national institutions of government and culture are to be found in the capital region, which results in the tendency to believe that what is authentically Canadian is found there, which is something that, again, according to poll, those east, west, and north of that region would like to have changed. Our resources have made Alberta the wealthiest province and have attracted young, energetic people to work here. These typically are more independent-minded and opportunity-focused than the thinking is out east, which is characterized by thinking that the government is the provider of every good gift and the guarder of our rights, and actually the provider of our rights, that they're not naturally given to us, that we don't naturally already possess them. Much of Canada's history has been arranged to accommodate continued Quebecois demands. This has included mandated federal bilingualism, even in parts of the country with few French speakers. Even as Quebec itself limits the ability to use English in its own borders, we are required in other areas of the country to federally provide French. That such unjust ideas could even be imagined are really kind of beyond the thinking of anyone in the West. So this includes the idea that I was surprised to find out when I was doing the research that at the time of the repatriation of the Constitution in the 1982 Act, there was actual discussion whether Quebec and Ontario should have veto powers. When Canada Day celebrations that marked 150 years since Confederation took place, the Prime Minister listed every province and territory by name except Alberta. And some people claim this was an oversight, but it's viewed by those of us in the West as an intentional slight because of difficulties that we have caused him in his policies. Continued and renewed federal efforts to register, limit, or confiscate firearms illustrate to Westerners that Ottawa does not understand or care about the traditions and ways of life that are common west of the Manitoba border. We sometimes use the term the Laurentian elite, which refers, it's Western separatist way of referring to those who have wealth and power and live within the St. Lawrence lowlands. So if the Laurentian elite find guns and their use distasteful, this is of little actual concern to Westerners who enjoy hunting and sporting, and even the knowledge that guns are a very real protector of liberty and property when it's needed. The West does not tend to trust government near as much as Central Canada complacently does. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms was introduced by the Liberal government in power in 1982 as part of the repatriation of the Constitution. And it raised concerns at that time from lots of different places across the country, in large part, I think, because it undercut the common law tradition that had been functionally and profitably in place, but also very much because it seems like a very flawed document in itself. So right before it lists these rights that it says it's protecting, Section 1 says, quote, "The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society." So for people who are accustomed to self-reliance and small government like we are in the West, what was supposed to have been, I guess, some kind of an expression of freedom is frequently seen by us as a flawed system that just gives government more power. We actually see this, I think, increasingly today, which is, I think, part of the reason why there has been renewed energy given to separatism, is because we're seeing more heavy-handed policies and actions by government in the face of COVID and handing down and putting down restrictions. The Canadian Wheat Board, or the CWB, was dissolved in 2015. But while it existed, it prohibited Western farmers from finding better markets for their crops. So all wheat had to be sold through the Wheat Board. So it provided stability in pricing, which a lot of farmers, including my grandfather, unfortunately, appreciated. They liked the idea of the security and the stability. But it did this in a way that limited Western income and criminalized them if they tried to sell to any other markets. The CWB was the only significant state trading enterprise exporter worldwide other than in communist China. Jonathan M. Wellham said that is Canada's, lavish social welfare system rewards passivity and hampers creativity, which again is contrary to the general Western way of looking at opportunity and personal reliance. So with our wealth coming directly, physically, and visibly from our own efforts, the West has a more practical view of life. It's less focused on utopian ideals of what we'd like to be and more grounded in the realities of what is. While it would be nice to free ourselves from reliance on limited fossil fuels, we're unable to do so effectively at present. Within 30 years, it's estimated there will be double the amount of plastic waste from solar panels alone as there is total waste right now. The recent snowstorm crisis in Texas illustrated that wind turbines cannot be relied upon as a stable power source, and electric vehicles still need a fossil fuel-based source to run multiple components of their system. Each of these give the lie to federal efforts to penalize extraction, refinement, and use of needed resources in terms of fossil fuels. This is even more alienating to Western producers when we operate increasingly clean and responsible industries that account for minimal pollution, while countries like China ignore pollution considerations. They output considerably more pollutants, and they have no imposition of additional costs as fees or fines, and this allows them to compete more successfully even within our own national markets. In the 1950s and 60s, Eastern Canada imported foreign oil rather than purchasing from our own domestic holdings. This included subsidizing petroleum from the Middle East. So that occurred at least in 1974. Without the infrastructure that we have now, it may have been more economical for the East to import. But at the same time, the message of equalization payments is that we're supposed to be all this together. So, we get mixed messages on this. Subsidies, while helpful to Eastern consumers who had to purchase power, meant revenue loss to Western producers. The National Energy Program of the 1980s, under the elder Trudeau, sought to nationalize the oil resources of the West. This resulted in the loss of $50 to $100 billion from Alberta. The global recession of the early 1980s prompted a 33% increase in consumer bankruptcy for Canadians generally. The policies of the federal government in undervaluing Western resources saw that increase by 150% for us. While the NEP no longer exists, its thinking is continued in various forms when, for instance, Quebec, apparently unaware of actual environmental management and the necessities of the industry, criticizes Alberta's oil sands while still expecting to benefit from transfer payments that are made possible by the production of these oil sands. It is also seen that when the incoming American president, himself also apparently ignorant of the realities of the resource industry and how it serves his own people, can unilaterally shut down important pipelines with great impact to Albertan workers. And our Prime Minister quietly acquiesces to this, makes no complaints. That pipelines are more reliable and environmentally respectful than many other options does not get attention from those who are more concerned with virtue signaling and politically correct posturing than understanding practical realities. While there is talk and pressure on Alberta to better diversify our economy from relying too much on oil wealth, it's not really well acknowledged that our attempts to use the so-called Heritage Fund to assist in this diversification is one of the three stated objectives of the Heritage Fund, is handicapped by lost revenue. In 2017, the province had a $10.5 billion budget deficit. It is equalization payments entrenched in the actual constitution that probably account for the bulk of provincial resentment at being abused in Confederation. In 2017, $18 billion was sent east from Western provinces, except Newfoundland and Labrador did not receive, with $11 billion of that going to Quebec. Quebec and Manitoba have hydropower, which means that they can provide power to their residents at lower prices, which has an effect in terms of the calculation for the equalization payments. So it means that they can benefit from that. At the same time, because Alberta has chosen to not penalize its own citizens by charging a sales tax, we are actually punished for not charging sales tax because it is seen in equalization calculations that we could get revenue from that and we choose not to. For the last half dozen or so years, at least BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland have not received equalization. Ontario has been a part of this group not receiving equalization for the last 2 years. In 2020-2021, equalization payments totaled $20.6 billion given to 5 provinces, with Quebec receiving $13 billion. And so the graphic, the image that you can see on the screen is showing you the per capita cost and benefit. And so you can see, for instance, that PEI gets a lot per capita, but it doesn't add up as much because its population is considerably less than Quebec, which has a smaller per capita. Premier Kenney of Alberta recently claimed that since equalization began in 1957, Alberta has received 0.02% of all payments, with our last receipt of payment in 1964-65, while Quebec has received $221 billion, or 51%. So, the feasibility of separation. So different polls report different numbers in response to different questions. Some polls are saying that half of Albertans see independence as a real possibility, with the greatest support coming from those who are 55 or older, who probably have some memory and experience of these policies. Other numbers indicate that maybe it's 60% of Albertans say that they would support a separatist movement, but it seems to be maybe most accurate that right now it's about 40%, with growing support as the frustrations with both federal and provincial leadership continue to mount. It is generally understood that the Clarity Act of 2000 would allow secession from Canada if a province or provinces had a clearly worded referendum question that resulted in the majority of the province's citizens agreeing to secession. When we take a look at how practical it is, though, one of the biggest things we're also looking at is financial. And so financially, we want to take, I think, a look at 3 areas, both the area from which we draw our resources, and our resources certainly are natural, but they're more than natural, our population, that is the people that can make use of those resources, and then how it has historically transformed into wealth. So different sources recognize different numbers of sovereign states. Generally, it's around 192 up to 213. As an independent nation, our area would place us at number 40, just below Myanmar and above Afghanistan in terms of our land area. Our population at 126 would be below Kuwait, above Panama. And our GDP would be 43, 44, 45, depending on the source, between Finland and Vietnam, or between Finland and Colombia. Again, the sources are a little bit different on that. But that is our gross domestic product. If we were to take a look at it as per capita, we'd actually be in either 5th or 8th, again from different sources, position, after Ireland and before Switzerland or Norway, which obviously points to a very strong economy, a very strong likelihood of us being able to generate wealth for our needs. In terms of the concerns, it seems like there are practically very few concerns that need to have strenuous explanation for how we would address them. Perhaps the biggest, of course, is the fact that we would be a landlocked country. We would not have our own access to a port. There are right now 44 landlocked countries in the world. Of those landlocked countries, 5 of them have a GDP greater than Alberta currently has. One of which is Switzerland, which has got a great GDP. And so it does not look like that is an unanswerable concern. Certainly countries are able to trade with one another and provide access. And we also, if we are going to be essentially surrounded by old Canada, they still would like to have access through and over us. And so there's the ability for us to be able to work out negotiation with that. It's very typical for countries to be able to do such things with one another, not be petty in not allowing transportation access. Security issues related to our own internal police force, to a military that is concerned to make sure that we are protected from outside aggression, and border security are all very answerable questions. Many jurisdictions, including American states, have actually got their own abilities to provide those things, and so it's not inconceivable for Alberta to provide for those ourselves. Economic issues are related to provision of our own currency, payment of a debt that could be argued is owed by us to Canada, the costs of separation, and a continuing pension plan. So some of those, for instance, the pension plan, are things that our citizens would continue to have access to as Canadian citizens. And then when they are no longer Canadian citizens, we would have in place a structure that already, and I am going to talk about particular political platform here, would already be in place and be provided for the citizens of the new nation. A final, maybe I guess also worthwhile consideration is the disunity amongst the different political parties that are looking for independence. There are actually only 2 current political parties in Alberta who are advocating for our own independence, and I'm going to speak to the difference with them in the next slide, so I'm going to put that one off. When we're looking at how could independence come about, or what would it look like, there really seem to be 3 main options for Alberta to leave dysfunctional confederation. One is that we would go it alone. That image that says the Alberta Independence Party is an old image. It was a nice graphic, but it has a wrong name on it. The Alberta Independence Party is actually the Independence Party. So one option is for Alberta to go it alone. Another option is for Alberta to go with one or more other provinces or territories. And a third option is to seek admission as a new American state. Each of these has benefits and drawbacks, although any one of them would seem to offer greater prosperity, justice, and freedom to our people than is currently enjoyed within Canadian Confederation. It would also be up to the framers of the new nation to determine which particular form and structure of government would be best for that new country, although all those options would be by, for, and of the people, so best serving Albertans. Some people have concerns that joining the United States would place us at a similar disadvantage to our current relationship with Ottawa. This does ignore a significant difference with the American system, however, that has a strong states' rights framework that actually protects each state very strongly and allows them to exercise rights that we do not have access to in Canada. One option that has been explicitly rejected by the Independence Party, which is the party that I am actively working with, is that we should give another try to working within Confederation, that we should try to make it more fair. This strikes me as being like a woman in an abusive relationship, keeping on going back because this time he's going to change. The only other Alberta First Party believes that there still is life in that idea, that should be given a try. And so the Independence Party is the only party that is truly and wholly working towards actual independence. So what does that mean now? Well, what I think that means is that you take a look. I'm in favor of the Independence Party. It's still a growing party, but it's a party that I believe has got a lot of value, and it's got a lot of potential in terms of where they're going and what they want to be, not the same old. So you can take a look at that party's website and Facebook group. You can explore other parties and other groups' positions and how they would like to move forward with independence. You should ask questions of those who may be able to answer them. When you feel able to, you should take out a membership, which allows you also to influence the direction that the policy or that the party takes. And I believe you should get involved and actually do something to help bring about what we are looking for. F.H. Underhill said, "A nation is a body of people who have done great things together in the past and who hope to do great things together in the future." That's what I want. I want us to be able to do great things together for this people.